A very warm welcome everyone to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name's Barry Sadler, and today I'm going to be talking about the interaction between leisure sailing events such as sailing regattas and commercial shipping. For those of you new to the podcast, a special welcome to you, and of course for those regular listeners, welcome back. I hope you enjoy this latest episode. As I make this podcast, we are halfway through one of the UK's largest sporting events, and that is the Cowes Week Sailing Regatta that happens every year at around the end of July to the beginning of August. Traditionally, Cowes Week takes place after Glorious Goodwood, the 5-day flat racing event, and what's known as the Glorious 12th, which is the first day of the grouse shooting season here in the UK. Occasionally the traditional dates are changed to ensure that racing is optimum, taking into account the tides and other factors. In 2012 the dates were adjusted, of course, to avoid a clash with the Olympic Games, and every now and again the date is moved due to some other major sporting event. But as I say, traditionally it takes place in between Glorious Goodwood and the Glorious 12th, which means that in general it will commence on a Saturday, normally right at the end of July, occasionally in the first couple of days of August. Now, Cowes Week goes back nearly 200 years, and the first race was for a gold cup with a value of about £100, which was held in 1826, with just 7 yachts under the flag of the Royal Yacht Club, which of course later became the Royal Yacht Squadron in 1833. Now, this regatta kept going every year, normally with royal assent, and King George IV indicated his approval of the event by presenting a cup known as the King's Cup at every event until 1939. Those of you lucky enough to have been in the Royal Yacht Squadron castle will have seen that there are numerous King's Cups on display within the castle. Also, if you happen to be in Bermuda at the Royal Bermudan Yacht Club, there's also a King's Cup there. As I say, King George IV donated these cups and were presented at every single event until 1939. Now, of course, Cowes Week has been held every year, with the exception of 2020, where COVID put pace to it. Also, of course, during the wars, Cowes Week also became a bit of a victim. But modern Cowes Week pretty much started in 1964, when, on the suggestion of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, who of course was a regular competitor at Cowes Week and at the time Admiral of the Royal Yacht Squadron, suggested that the Cowes combined the clubs there, and the Cowes combined clubs were formed to run and organise the regatta. Now, Cowes combined clubs is represented by 7 clubs: Royal Yacht Squadron, Royal London Yacht Club, Royal Thames Yacht Club, Royal Southampton Yacht Club, Royal Southern Yacht Club, the Island Sailing Club, and the Royal Ocean Racing Club. And they formed a committee known as the Cowes Town Regatta Committee. Now, this was the start of modern Cowes Week, which until 1995 was supported by the local Isle of Wight County Council, but in 1995 came corporate sponsorship in the form of Scandia. And some of you listening to this podcast will remember Scandia Cowes Week, and for 14 years that's what it was called. And the relationship that Cowes Week had with their sponsors, their title sponsors Scandia, made major improvements to the infrastructure in Cowes and made possible even more social events at this excellent sailing regatta. Lots has happened since 1826, and the modern Cowes Week will normally attract somewhere in the region of around 500 boats, somewhere around 5,000 competitors racing in and around those 500 boats, and spectator-wise, pretty consistent. Somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people will watch the Cowes Week Regatta every year. Cowes Week Regatta is still the world's largest regular sailing regatta, and its success lies mainly with the volunteers and the passion that is shown by everybody involved in this event to make it a special week for sailors when they come to the island shore. Cowes Week is, of course, run within a statutory harbour area. In fact, it spreads over 2 statutory harbour areas as courses are plotted throughout the western, central and eastern Solent to accommodate the numerous classes of yachts that come to race. Southampton's statutory harbour area and Portsmouth's statutory harbour area play host to Cowes Week. Of course, Cowes itself has its own statutory harbour area, and the coming and going of yachts from their moorings is controlled heavily by the Cowes Harbour Master. But what are the implications of holding such a huge sailing event, one within a statutory harbour area and 2 within the Solent itself, which, although is the home of yachting, is also home to several very large ports? Port of Southampton, of course the Port of Portsmouth, and Cowes itself is a very, very busy harbour. So the ability to have sailing yachts and huge commercial vessels sharing the same stretch of water is managed very, very carefully on a year-round basis. Now, UK legislation requires statutory harbour authorities like Southampton and Portsmouth to have due consideration to the activities that happen within their statutory areas, and to ensure that as far as possible they provide navigation marks and information to allow these events to happen safely. But most important to recognise is the fact that the running of these events remains the responsibility of the organisers of such events, and therefore the Cowes Combined Clubs, modern day known as Cowes Week Limited, retain responsibility for the running of the actual event itself. But Southampton, for instance, has an obligation to ensure that in running the regatta, that Cowes Week Limited do it in a proper and effective way. The Port Marine Safety Code is the UK's national framework for port safety. It was first issued in 2000, most recently reissued in 2016 and updated just recently in April 2025. It reinforces accountability, proportional compliance and clarity for non-statutory marine facilities. Now, although the Port Marine Safety Code is a non-statutory code, it carries some pretty strong expectations. And non-compliance, even indirect non-compliance, may be used as evidence of a breach under established and existing health and safety and maritime legislation. Now, the Port Marine Safety Code's key principles mean that a duty holder must be appointed by the port. The port must provide an independent designated person to audit the safety systems of the port. A strong and robust marine safety management system, which is grounded in formal and proportionate risk assessment, must be provided and of course maintained. And along with any safety management system comes continuous audit and review to ensure the performance of the safety management system remains as good as possible. The code itself places the onus squarely on event organisers to conduct comprehensive risk assessments for any event on navigable waters that may affect other harbour users or navigational safety. And these events do include races, regattas, displays, swims, rallies, even demonstrations involving any form of craft. And of course, this does include Cowes Week itself. Therefore, Southampton, as the statutory harbour authority, will insist that Cowes Week Limited provide us with a comprehensive risk assessment as to how the Cowes Week Regatta is going to be run. This risk assessment will include many identifications of hazards such as strong winds, such as injuries afloat, such as clashes with commercial vessels, and that risk assessment must be presented to the statutory harbour authority in order for it to be reviewed to ensure that the organisers of Cowes Week are following all the required legislation, all the required safety precautions, and are running the event in such a way that the possibility of harm to any of the competitors is as low as possible. Now, it's really important that any event organiser consults with the relevant harbour authority in which they are operating their event at a very, very early stage. In Southampton, we insist that we are informed of any such events greater than 28 days in advance. This allows us in the port to review the risk assessment, to review the event itself, and if necessary to put into place any measures that we as a port think are necessary to assist with the safe operation and execution of the sailing regatta. Now, bearing in mind that Cowes Week, well, this year, 2025, 442 yachts is an incredibly large event, and therefore we must ensure that the risk assessment itself is thorough enough and the measures that are put in place by Cowes Week themselves are sufficient enough. But as a port, we do our own risk assessment, of course, on the conduct of the Cowes Week Regatta within our statutory harbour area. We put in place measures such as provision of extra patrol vessels, the engagement of Cowes Week support vessels, so we train and authorise Cowes Week safety ribs to act with our afloat harbour master's representative on board a vessel known as the Southampton Patrol. And where I come in, we do place something called a platform pilot on with the starting team in the Royal Yacht Squadron platform itself. One of the most important elements of being able to run a huge sailing regatta alongside a commercial shipping lane with the largest container ships in the world transiting it is, of course, communication. Forming the link between the start team, the race management team, Southampton VTS, and of course the vessels themselves is paramount so that everybody knows what's happening on the water and the potential for any clashes are identified at an early stage and eliminated where necessary. The platform pilot themselves goes down to the Royal Yacht Squadron platform and liaises directly with the starting team of the regatta. The platform pilot can advise the principal race officer on the potential conflicts of large vessels coming and going to the port during, in particular, the start sequence, and can, in extreme cases, request that the Cowes Week Regatta itself is paused to allow a large vessel through. The starts of each class of races, and typically there are around 30 starts every day. The starts of each class of vessel are where we have large numbers of sailing yachts on the start line in close vicinity to one another, which can pose hazards to vessels coming to and from the port of Southampton. Once the race has been started, the natural stringing out of vessels as they proceed around their pre-planned course means that meeting these guys during the race generally means that the yachts are strung out enough for them not to pose so much of a risk as they do at the start. But of course, at the start of any competitive sailing race, you're going to have lots of yachts on the start line, all vying for the best position to get going on the race course, and this means that ultimately large clusters of yachts will be present within an area negotiated by very, very large vessels. In the port of Southampton, this is complicated further by the fact that the start line for Cowes Week partially runs through what we call our precautionary area. In Southampton, we have a very large S-bend that large vessels have to negotiate on their way into the port and on their way out for that matter. The biggest turn within this S-bend is known as the West Brambles turn. Now, in previous podcasts, I've talked about this turn and talked about how critical it is to ensure that a large vessel is turning fast enough and in the correct position to make this critical 140 degree turn. Now, the start lines themselves don't run directly through the middle of the turn, but they are fairly close to the start inwards or the finish outwards of the West Bramble turn. So as well as large numbers of yachts potentially impeding large vessels as they follow the narrow channel, there is scope for confusion if that large vessel is turning rapidly and the skippers of small boats are trying to judge whether or not they're going to be able to clear the large vessel as it comes to and from the port. So a lot of work is done behind the scenes by Cowes Week Limited to provide a safety booklet advising competitors of the dangers involved with impeding these large vessels as they make the West Bramble turn. I, as a pilot, every year will go to the skipper's briefing. Skipper's briefing this year in 2025 was well attended, and the skippers sat and listened very, very carefully as I explained how tricky it was to navigate huge ships through large clusters of yachts, and reiterated to skippers what it meant to impede an ultra-large vessel as it, 1, navigates along a narrow channel, and 2, as it makes this critical West Bramble turn. Finally, of course, there's the platform pilot who can give advice on the day should there be any potential clashes between any start sequence and any large vessel coming and going to the port. I was platform pilot a few days ago, and we had a 400 metre container ship coming in to the port of Southampton, but this was combined with a course which, although it didn't take the yachts directly across the path of the container ship, did place the yachts in a position where if they were to lose the wind, and the wind was a little bit fluky at the time, if they were to lose the wind and not be able to make a good passage across the precautionary area, that they would subsequently impede the passage of this large container vessel. So when the pilots boarded the large container vessel, I made contact with Southampton VTS and subsequently with the pilots on board the ship. I described the racing and described where the yachts were going to, where their first windward mark was that they would turn around as part of the race, and we discussed the ability for the ship to safely come through the starting sequence. Due to the lack of wind, due to the courses that had been set, it was decided that we couldn't continue with the start sequence at Cowes Week. So I approached the principal race officer and explained the fact that this ultra-large container ship was coming in, and requested that the start sequence be postponed for 15 minutes. Whenever I make a request like this, it's a big deal. Obviously, the world's largest sailing regatta being paused has lots of implications. It has implications on finish time. It has implications on media coverage. So asking them to suspend the start sequence isn't done lightly. But a few days ago, it was absolutely necessary to allow this large ship coming through. The CMA CGM George Forster was actually the name of the ship, 400 metres long and 54 metres wide. She was a partly laden container ship, and we stopped the start sequence. That 15-minute pause in the start sequence allowed yachts that had already started to clear the precautionary area. Yachts that were waiting to start kept well clear of the container ship as it came through. So as the container ship had passed through the starting area, the start sequence recommenced and the yacht started again astern of the container vessel. Happily, it coincided with a rise in the wind speed. So at the end of the day, everybody was happy. But regardless of that, the principal race officer, the management team at Cowsweek, the pilots on the ship, the harbour master, Southampton VTS, are all really happy when, after close consultation, action is taken to allow these ships to navigate the precautionary area without coming across these huge clusters of yachts. Without having a platform pilot on scene and advising the race team directly, it is possible that the race team may get the ETA of the inward bound ship wrong. They may not see any potential danger with starts going off if they run in the same direction that the ship was going, which effectively they were, and may have missed the fact that some yachts, due to the light wind, were being set along the edge of the precautionary area where the ship would potentially have had to navigate in order to take into account the cross tide, the flood tide that was setting the vessel as it made the 140-degree west Bramble turn. So this close liaison does have massive safety implications if it's not made, but at the same time, the provision of this close communication ensures that a huge sailing event can be conducted very safely within the shipping routes of the port of Southampton and alongside some of the world's largest container vessels. I've been a platform pilot at Cowsweek for 25 years now, and I remember the Olympic team coming to the platform in 2010 to watch how we ran Cowsweek, because they were considering what they had to do down in Weymouth for the Olympic sailing events that were taking place in 2012. On that day, we had a 300-metre container ship coming through the starts. We didn't have to pause the starts on that day because the container ship was able to time its run through the precautionary area to coincide with the start of run one race and to get through before the start of the next race. This was something that was planned between myself and the race team on the day to allow the ship to come in at a certain speed, be at a certain point at a certain time, so that the effect of the starts were minimal on the ship's ability to make the West Bramble turn. The Olympic management team that were there at the time were absolutely astounded that we were able to get the ship through the starts without there being any incidents, without any yachts being disadvantaged, and without the ship itself being impeded. We explained very, very carefully that it was the close liaison between the statutory Harbour Authority, the pilots both on the platform and on the ship, and the race team themselves that allow us to be able to thread these huge ships through these large sailing regattas. Yes, the precautions that we take on the day are vitally important, but I think going back to risk assessments under the Port Marine Safety Code and the necessity for those people that are organising an event to start to coordinate with the port at an early stage are incredibly important. The risk assessment that any event organiser, including a huge event like Cowswick, has to do must identify the potential hazards that exist within the event itself. Collision, poor visibility, interference with commercial traffic, collisions, support craft. They must determine who is at risk: participants, spectators, harbour users, commercial vessels. They must describe the controls and mitigations that are aimed at making risks as low as reasonably practicable. And they must include in their risk assessment to us logistics such as timetables, maps, VHF channels, starting lines, who's been consulted, emergency protocols, emergency landing stages, the officials that are in charge, participant lists, communication channels. All these sorts of things need to be communicated at an early stage to the statutory Harbour Authority so that close liaison can start way before the platform pilot arrives on the platform to ensure that the ultimate execution of such a huge sailing event is possible and is safe when sharing the same water with huge commercial vessels. Next year is the 200th anniversary of this historic sailing regatta. It's going to be a big event. There will, I dare say, be more participants next year than the 442 that we have this year. There may be more races, there may be extra days. There will be other on-water events happening other than just the sailing. And it will all require thorough risk assessment, close liaison with all interested parties, including statutory harbour authorities, spectators, councils, pilots, harbour masters, VTS, and anybody else that's involved with the safe navigation of traffic within the area to ensure that such a historic event is able to take place safely. I hope you found this insight into how we can run such a huge sailing event within a statutory harbour authority next door to large ships interesting, and that you now appreciate that they don't just sound a gun and start the yachts racing. There is a huge amount of work that goes into this massive sailing regatta to ensure that every year it goes off safely, provides the greatest spectacle possible for those 100,000 spectators that make the journey to the island to watch this historic event, and at the same time allow commercial vessels to continue on their passage to and from the major ports within the Solent, ensuring that global trade continues regardless of the size of the regatta. Thank you all very much for listening to this podcast, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll be back again soon. Thank you very much.